Okay, let's go through this just to get a good sense of how complicated vegetation response is to the climate variability and change forcing in terms of temperature, precipitation, humidity, but there are also biogeochemical factors, competitions between species, which we have implied by looking at broadleaf, needleleaf shrubs, C3, C4, and so on, barren land, etc. I will just go through a couple of papers without any real details to show some results that will give you a sense of how complicated things are. This is a modeling paper that looked at the forcing of the East African vegetation in response to Indo-Pacific temperature forcing. So as you know, there is El Nino, La Nina in the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean responds with also an east-west pattern, and there is a big debate about whether there is a independent Indian Ocean dipole and so on. But it's fairly clear that Pacific forcing can be enhanced by Indian Ocean response, and if you are honest about searching through the literature, you may find that Indian Ocean is basically a tail to the Pacific response. So keeping that in mind, this paper looks at the precipitation changes. So it's just splitting the response into periodic, so El Nino, La Nina, and just the Pacific forcing, so just the typically eastern tropical Pacific, what is referred to as Nino 3 or Nino 3.4 SST anomalies, which correspond to changes in the Walker cell. We haven't talked about Walker cell here, but I have plenty of podcasts elsewhere that you can look up. And then the tropical forcing, so how other regions of the tropical SSTs influence East African weather and climate and vegetation response. Obviously, as we said, Atlantic and Indian Ocean responses are not always independent of the Pacific, so there is some confounding of the results there, but one can always squeeze the data to see signals in other oceans that are independent of ENSO. They can be lead lag, for example. So, and this is what the observations say in terms of precipitation. So do they all add up to this? Well, you have to conclude for yourself, but the models always tend to have issues, as we already mentioned, but you can see that there is the increased precipitation and decreased precipitation, which are broadly consistent, one would say. Net primary production and leaf area index tell us what we already talked about in terms of aerial coverage change versus net primary production change. We looked at it for broadleaf, needleleaf, and so on. So net primary production change, periodic change, El Nino, La Nina, just the Pacific and the tropical forcing. And these are the lead lag relations in the vegetation or NPP response with respect to the physical forcing. Obviously, vegetation doesn't respond immediately for excess rain or deficit rain, especially because during deficit rains, vegetation can use the root system to keep taking water until a meteorological drought, just the deficit rain, becomes a ecological drought, for example, and lasts long enough to affect soil moisture at root depth and so on. Plus, during rainy seasons, vegetation can take up the water and then act like a capacitor and release that water during drier periods. So there is always that lead lag that one has to worry about. Leaf area index is obviously not net primary production. Net primary production is estimated based on chlorophyll concentrations calibrated in various ways to correspond to net primary production, which you can think of as, let's say, food available for grazers and browsers and megafauna, whereas LAI is just like the aerial index that we had been looking at, and we already said how they can be very different. So you can see that LAI response is not as strong and extensive as NPP. All for periodic variability as well as Pacific and tropical forcing, and this is the total in observations. Okay, so there is here it looks like there is hardly any response, but obviously if you have cancelling responses from remote forcing versus, let's say, local forcing from the Indian Ocean, then you can have net signal that is small, but it doesn't mean that there hasn't been a climate impact. This paper looks more carefully at the details of the climatology and trends, which again yield interesting responses. So focusing on East Africa, which is obviously the cradle of human evolution, as we have implied so far. So you can see that even within this little region, the complexity of the vegetation distribution now is the western end, which is humid forests, and you get into subhumid regions as you go north and southeast. And you get semi-arid regions at the northern end, of course, and arid regions here, complicated distributions of the semi-arid between humid, subhumid, and arid, and there is tropical highlands, which are basically considered important for maybe steering the monsoon and so on. So depending on which side of the highlands you are, you can be humid, semi-humid, or semi-arid and arid, okay, as expected. So here is the mean precipitation, temperature, and NDVI from 1982 to 2015. Again shows the complex distributions of precipitation. Temperature tends to have larger decorrelation scale, so you can see smoother distributions of temperature regimes than precipitation, especially in some of these regions here. And of course NDVI is much more complicated. So this is a combination of soil properties, soil erosion, humidity, precipitation, and of course during this time human activity as well. But even more interesting is if you look at spatial distribution of the trends in precipitation, temperature, and NDVI during the same period of 1982 to 2015, you can see how there are regions which have negative trends and there are regions which have positive trends in the humid, subhumid region and semi-arid regions here, but also these arid regions here are semi-arid, arid regions are having positive trends as well. Okay, in precipitation, and temperatures again are more uniform. Decorrelation scales are larger than precipitation. And vegetation response, of course, is quite complicated because of the biophysical factors that matter, the competition that we talked about, how vegetation integrates these environmental signals. It's called extraction of weak links. So the links for vegetation with precipitation and temperature individually may not be very strong, but they can integrate it to extract a stronger link, especially if you include humidity as well. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out, that when we look at a very coarse resolution model like we have been looking at for the past, you have to basically worry about whether such details in vegetation response would have mattered, whether humans only cared about large-scale changes like this uniform change here versus this uniform change, and not so much these small-scale changes. Plus, what does it mean when the model doesn't even resolve those small-scale changes, because the feedbacks can still be complicated in terms of biophysical feedbacks to climate and precipitation, vegetation, albedo feedbacks as well. This is just showing a correlation of NDVI and precipitation for different seasons. As we said, the long season during MAM and short season during SON. And I just wanted to say again that precipitation correlations and temperature correlations are not always positive. So you can see that there are patches of negative correlation positive correlations. So the correlations at grid scale can be very patchy. Does it matter for what we are discussing in terms of impacts on hominin evolution? And what does it mean in the modern era since Holocene? So we can look at a Holocene paper here for that. So this is something that focused just on Lake Dendy here again, and it shows nicely the ITCZ and the front here during June, July, August. So what do they do? They take all the evidences over the Holocene period from 12,000 years to the present, looking at river runoff, so strong and weak Nile runoffs using strontium isotopes. So look at the Blue Nile, White Nile, Sahara, and gradual, so coming out of the glaciation peak of the African humid period that we talked about, where Nile runoff is strong, gradual aridification, and then the Blue Nile gets humidified over this place here. Okay, so that's related to the Ethiopian region that we were looking at. This is looking at soil erosion using titanium as an indicator in sediments. So high erosion, low erosion corresponding to wet periods and dry periods, which is natural. And then you look at the insolation forcing over this period using deuterium. Let's not worry about that. And this is the C13 in various proxies, which gives you a sense of how atmospheric CO2 must have varied, because the C13 depletion in photosynthetic organic material tells you that if there is high C13 content, then CO2 must have been lower in concentration. So plants were taking up more C13. When they can get enough C12, they prefer to take up C12 because energetically it's cheaper. So this also corresponds to the C3, C12 kind of issue we were talking about. So just looking at the poaceae and a percentage of trees over this period, you can see the grasses, percentage of grasses poaceae was very high as we came out of the cold period. We were still in the last bit of younger Dryas and so on. So you can see that junipers were smaller and podocarpus were higher in terms of percentages, dominated of course by grasses. And as we went forward, junipers picked up during this dry period, and podocarpus remained high during maybe in the beginning period, and junipers picked up here, and then they picked up also in the dry period, but then podocarpus evolved here. So this tells you again how complicated vegetation response is, even though the grasslands have dropped. But here we have more and more human impact. This is not a natural system. Most of the systems we were looking before, from 135,000 years to let's say about 22,000 years, the assumption is that hunter-gatherers did not have the kind of large-scale clearing impact that the humans, sapiens, had during the Holocene, because we were already into the thick of agricultural revolution, domesticated C4, C3 competition, and that would have had larger impact on vegetation here. So extracting climate response can be complicated in that sense. So I just wanted to add that to say that we have to keep that complicated vegetation response even in a natural world in mind when we are using a coarse resolution model with a simplified dynamic vegetation model to infer climate impacts on vegetation, and then potentially vegetation impact on hominin diaspora and so on. Okay, so let's leave this chapter here, and then we can come back in the next chapter and look more specifically at human interactions with climate variability and change. Okay.